welcome everybody that's in the room and that's also online to this seminar on Uganda, a model for refugee hosting. My name is Nina Willen. I'm the director of the Africa program at the Egmont Institute, and I'm delighted to have four speakers with me today to discuss this topic. As some of you already have noticed, we've already published two policy briefs on the topic by three of the people who are in the room here today. We have, first of all, before the summer, we published a policy brief by Nina Sudan, who used to work here at the Egmont Institute, on the politics of food and the myth of the self-reliant refugee in Uganda. So for those of you who haven't seen it yet, it's online on the Egmont website. And then just a few days ago, I think it's 2 days ago, we published another policy brief on a similar topic by Christophe Titika and Rose Derricks on the end of Uganda's refugee model, or just a transition. So as we can see, this is a topic that's gathering quite a lot of attention for good reasons. And today we have all of the authors here to discuss their policy briefs and the findings of the policy briefs. And we also have very happy to have a moderator. We have Dr. Frank Ahimbimwe, sorry for the pronunciation, who's a senior lecturer at the Mambara University of Science and Technology in Uganda, and who is a guest professor at IOB at the University of Antwerp, who is with us online. Today we have 2 hours for this seminar, which means that we have quite some time for the presentations of the different authors of the papers. We have said that around 20 minutes for each paper authors. And then Frank will intervene with some questions and comments on the papers, and then we will launch more of an open discussions with the people both in the room and online. So unless you have anything else that you want to add, and I think I already presented perhaps the speakers, Christophe Titika, who is a professor at IOB, University of Antwerp, and we're very lucky to also have him as a senior associate fellow at the Egmont Institute since a month. And then we have Rose Derricks, who is an FWO PhD student at the IOB at the University of Antwerp. And we have Nina Sudan, who is a graduate in international politics and who has recently done quite a lot of field work in Uganda and Burundi. And she's now doing research focusing on refugees and border dynamics in Eastern Africa. So I think we have a panel of excellent speakers and experts on the topic. And I hope that you will be dynamic with questions once we open the floor for questions. But now I'm giving the floor for about 20 minutes to Nina, and I'm going to try to open up the...
Or do you need to share your screen?
I need to share my screen. I think it's going to come like this, no?
I think it's more.
I think it is.
Yeah. Okay, so good morning. Thank you, Nina, for this introduction and for the invitation to this seminar on Uganda's refugee model, a topic I've been researching but also writing on in a recently published Egmont policy brief titled The Politics of Food and the Myth of the Self-Reliant Refugee in Uganda. So the aim of this presentation today is to go over some key insights of this brief, but I do also welcome any additional perspectives or feedback to contribute to the discussion. So to give a bit of context, this brief explored the disconnect between the current refugee framework in Uganda on the one hand, and then the lived experiences of refugees in Ugandan settlements on the other. Drawing on field work I conducted in northern Uganda in June and July of last year, as part of my master's thesis. No? Oh yeah, perfect. Um, sure. Again. This one, the second one. In different refugee settlements in northern Uganda. So as you can see here, I did interviews with refugee in Bidi Bidi settlement, in Vepi and Rhino camp in the West Nile region of Uganda. And so my initial research focused on perceptions of borders and trajectories of mobility, but conversations with refugees at the time highlighted challenges linked to protracted displacement in the settlements, especially in light of the, at the time, very recent reallocation of food assistance by World Food Programme. I then returned to Uganda for additional fieldwork this summer as part of a larger research project working on life narratives of refugees in the African Great Lakes region, led by Professor Mambari. And not surprisingly, the same issues and concerns voiced last year continue to resurface even a year later. And so as one refugee shared, so when we first arrived, life was good. There was enough food for us, but I don't know why the UN sometimes changes things. Maybe because of conflicts in other countries, our food rations with refugees were drastically reduced. Even I am affected. I think that this simple but also meaningful quote highlights the profound impact of the current changes in geopolitical dynamic, but also donor priorities, which have led to significant cuts in food assistance by World Food Programme across multiple countries, from Afghanistan to Uganda. And so this reduction of food assistance has sort of coincided with a broader shift toward the promotion of refugee self-reliance, yet lived experience of refugees question the sustainability of this approach. And this also raises the important question of, while promoting refugee self-reliance is important, at what costs? So for the analysis, I'll divide my presentation in two parts. I'll start by briefly contextualizing Uganda's refugee model and the larger decline in refugee assistance, before then exploring the shift towards self-reliance and what this also means for refugees in practice. So Uganda currently hosts over 1.7 million refugees, which accounts for about 3.6% of the country's total population, but also marks a rise of 217% in the number of refugees since 2016. Refugees are primarily from the DRC and South Sudan, but also more recently from Sudan, making it the largest refugee hosting country on the continent. And to give you a bit of figures, on average, around 2,500 people seek refuge in Uganda every week, which accounts for roughly 2/3 of the number of arrivals to the European Union on a weekly basis. Yet Uganda was among UNHCR's top 13 most underfunded operations in 2023. So this aside, Uganda is often praised for its unique and also progressive open door refugee policy, which grants refugees not only freedom of movement and the ability to work, but also access to land, which marks, for example, a sharp contrast with neighboring country Kenya, which is known for its encampment practices of refugees. So in recent years, there have been growing calls for a more honest discussion about the Ugandan model. I think that's also why we're here today, as funding shortfalls and reduction in food assistance have placed significant pressure onto refugees. So this decline in assistance is then driven by broader politics of funding, the COVID-19 pandemic, but also Russia's war of aggression and the subsequent inflations, as a result of which donor nations have progressively reduced their funding towards long-term refugee populations, favoring more urgent and emerging humanitarian crises across the world, but also signaling a sort of broader shift in donor priorities. These funding updates and shortfalls can also be illustrated here on the right of the slide in UNHCR's funding updates of August 2024, which only secured 36% of the necessary funds, but also on the left then in Uganda's country refugee response plan, which is currently facing an 87% funding gap. So to then reduce the impact of this limited funding on the most vulnerable households, World Food Programme has implemented a prioritization strategy, both for food and cash assistance since 2021. And so at the time of my research last year, in July 2023, the final phase of this strategy had been implemented across all the 13 settlements of Uganda, leading to cuts in food assistance ranging from 40% for the most vulnerable households and to complete cuts in food assistance for those deemed self-reliant. So this prioritization strategy then again aligns with a broader strategic but also theoretical shift towards the promotion of self-reliance. I think that we can all agree that the reconceptualization of refugees from passive and vulnerable victims towards social capable actors is both timely and necessary. However, while this shift has often been framed as beneficial to refugees, it seems difficult to disentangle this narrative with the broader and donor community's interest in minimizing their financial contributions. So then again, this brings us to the question of self-reliance, yes, but at what cost? I think it would be simplistic to equate autonomy from food assistance with genuine self-reliance. And so then drawing on empirical data I gathered, narratives of refugees did highlight this gap between the self-reliant approach on the one hand and then their lived experiences on the other. So the quote here, so back then they used to help us. They provided food, free education, and even medical care. Now the situation has changed. We have no money and no food. As illustrated in this quote, the reduction of food assistance really emerged as a contentious issue while doing my fieldwork, as many were and still are unable to meet their basic needs. These reductions of food assistance were also stated to occur alongside cuts in other essential areas and services, including healthcare and education, but to also have broader implication on refugee and host communities, since as resources become scarcer, existing tensions between both communities surrounding issues of land access, ownership, water, firewood have all been intensified. And in an interview, a humanitarian worker also highlighted how these cuts have sort of forced refugees to adopt harmful coping strategies, including instances of child labor, transactional sex, paired with rising rates of suicides, domestic and gender-based violence. So this promotion of self-reliance has then led to sort of responsabilization of refugees who are now expected to meet their basic needs on their own, partly through Uganda's model of land allocation, but then also through agriculture as a pathway to achieve self-reliance. However, many refugees still face significant challenges, ranging from lack of access to fertile land, unpredictable climate conditions, which are only projected to worsen over time, but often the lack of the needed agricultural skills as well. So this is reflected in this quote here. So here UNHCR has bought land from the host because this is all about farming. And for us South Sudanese, all of us are not farmers. So based on the interviews I conducted, self-reliance currently seems far from being a reality for many refugees. Rather than fostering self-reliance, I think that the reduction of food assistance has rather widened the gap between its theoretical promise and refugees' lived realities. So this situation has also led to a growing awareness for refugees of their temporary settlements in Uganda, prompting thoughts of unfeasible survival, but also return. And this quote in particular struck me. When you visit the health center, you can see refugees who have died from hunger or illness. Some have chosen to return to South Sudan, to their land, but some of them were killed before even reaching their destination. So to conclude, while promoting self-reliance is theoretically a positive step, cuts in food assistance and the over-reliance of agriculture as a pathway to self-reliance have actually led to increased hardship for refugees. And so I think that while fostering self-reliance is important, it should not be used to reframe a lack of solutions for displaced communities. And on the other hand, World Food's program, arguably premature reduction of food assistance, has also exacerbated structural flaws in Uganda's refugee model, particularly concerning issues of land ownership, land access, but also regarding existing grievances between host and refugee communities. So looking ahead, several important questions arise on the future of Uganda's refugee model. particularly how declining international support will affect the implementation of the self-reliance agenda, but also how these shifting dynamics, how these will impact both intra-refugee relationships, but also interactions between host and refugee communities. Thank you.
Thank you. A rich presentation and interesting also to look ahead. And as we said before, that policy brief is available on the Egmont website. So I'm going to give the floor straight away to Christophe and Rose for their presentation, and then I'll give it to Frank to moderate the discussion. I'm now putting on your and then if you make a little.
Yes, thank you. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. The presentation of Christophe and I will actually touch upon many of the concepts that Nina also has highlighted. But I think it's nice that you ended with something that we open with, which is how Uganda's refugee model is changing at the moment in this light or in this context of humanitarian underfunding. So we will talk about not in prioritization, but on another policy which is quite recently and which we also see that has been implemented because or in this context of underfunding. So in the same context as which sparked prioritization. So yeah, Christophe is a professor at the Institute of Development Policy at the University of Antwerp, and I'm a PhD student, and we're both working on Uganda's refugee policy, just to say very briefly. I won't go into this in much detail because Nina has highlighted it already, but I think these quotes or these titles show that for quite some time, Uganda has been a model, considered to be a model in the international community in terms of refugee hosting. And for quite some time, this has ensured that the refugee response could get sufficient funding. So think about situation 2017, where 2016, 17, where a lot of South Sudanese came in. However, in the last couple of years, just as you indicated, some changes happened in terms of funding. So this is, I think, a funding update from around the same time as Nina showed you, but similarly, it shows a very large gap in funding for the overall refugee response in the country at the end of the second quarter this year. So to understand why this is happening, we have to zoom out a bit and look into global dynamics of humanitarian funding. So what we see there is that the overall funding hasn't decreased over the years. What has changed, however, is the division or like where the funding goes to. So what we see now is that a lot of funding goes to really emergency situations instead of protracted situations like the Ugandan one. At the same time, even though funding overall hasn't really decreased, research also shows that it is important to even have more funding for humanitarian crisis because many things are happening at the same time now and will also happen in the future. And we will have many complex, protracted situations. Right now we're seeing this, but also in the future. So this is why it is predicted that complex, protracted crisis will become the norm. And therefore, we also think it is important to look at Uganda. So not only because of this refugee model status and the progressive refugee policies the country has, but also because the refugee situation in Uganda is very much characterized by protractedness. Even though there is, of course, still always a smaller new influx of people as well. So there will be an emergency situation as well, but on a smaller scale. So this is, I mean, in our policy brief, we look a bit on the question, like, what is the new role model for Uganda in light of this sort of new reality of underfunding? And we do see that policies like prioritization has come up, but also, and this is more still on a management level, not yet affecting or impacting refugee lives as much, which is a transition of social services from NGOs to local governments. So this is the social services that are being delivered in a couple of sectors towards refugees, and the wish to shift this or to hand over the management, the service delivery, infrastructural development from NGOs to district local governments. So we came on this topic, well, we were doing semi-structured interviews around a broad range of topics, but we came across this new policy of transition, and we conducted, well, together with the context, around 100 semi-structured interviews, which mainly took place in Kampala. And last couple of months, I did field research in Adjumani, where I also visited some schools and a health center that were being transitioned. So for me, it was since the last year, because that's when my fieldwork started. For Christoph, it has been some years already. And this has informed the whole background of the policy brief. So we look at this sort of new reality, new model status from the concept of uncertainty. And we do think that it is very important to highlight two specific components of uncertainty. So on the one hand, it is really true that this global humanitarian underfunding, which is outside Uganda's refugee response, creates uncertainty in the refugee response. At the same time, we think we also should highlight that the way bureaucracies respond to this underfunding, and with bureaucracies, then I mean the INGOs working in the refugee response, the UN agencies, other international agencies, the government, donors, that the way that they respond also can add to uncertainty in the refugee response. And we think it is important to raise awareness also specifically on this part. So transition, just as I mentioned before, is the handover of social service delivery and infrastructure in refugee settlements from NGOs to district local governments. And this is happening at the moment in the sectors of water, education, and health. So you have to imagine that, for example, there is a motorized water pump, which is now being managed and maintained by an INGO such as Lutheran World Federation. And then the maintenance and the repair of this system is now being handed over to a government agency. It also means that staff in schools and in health centers will now be put on the government payroll. And the idea behind this is that also the government, but also donors want to reduce or want to merge the two parallel social service systems that exist at the moment, because there is a social service system for the refugees, but also for the hosts, and actually they are quite the same, because refugees do have access to social services. So there is this wish to integrate, specifically because the situation in Uganda is protracted. So it's seen as more sustainable to do this. So as I mentioned, implementation has started, though we have to say that it's a bit gradual. But there are facilities that are being transitioned at the moment. Even though it's not, for the moment, we didn't hear about a social service facility that was transitioned and all staff was put on government role. So it might be like a smaller portion of staff that will be put on the government payroll. Last year, during the Global Refugee Forum, the government of Uganda proved to be very enthusiastic about this topic. They seem to have major expectations. However, what is a bit worrying or caveat here might be is that the government of Uganda expects or wants donors to step in to fund this transition, because they're currently not able to pay or finance all the recurring costs, such as salaries for all new employees. And they do expect the donor community to step in. However, for the moment, it doesn't seem that the donors have a big appetite to do this. And that's where I will hand over to Christoph.
Okay, thanks, Rose. So what I want to highlight first is that this is not a new debate. So the transition from management of refugee services from humanitarian agencies to development agents and national governments, it's not a new one. It has been held for a long time. Here you see an excellent paper of this by Jeff Crisp from 2001. So it's also not uniquely Ugandan. For example, the UNHCR head, Sylvester Stevens, in 91, she wrote a report on this, and she basically highlighted, well, in these transitions, the difficulty is how do you fund it? And particularly, it's particularly hard to fund this in sub-Saharan Africa or in Africa. Another report from UNHCR from this period in 94 says, well, if we have these transitions, there's two difficulties. Well, the difficulty is that donors and national governments, they have different perceptions about this. For donors, the main aim of these transitions is that refugees eventually will achieve nationality or there will be voluntary repatriation. Whereas for national governments, they do not necessarily have the same incentives because the inflow of aid also has a number of advantages. And you see similar debates or similar tensions in Uganda. So what do we see? So on the one hand, the Ugandan government says, well, what we see here is an illustration of the lack of responsibility of the international community. And so it's important to highlight that Uganda became a role model around 2016, 17, and it's not a coincidence because in 2015, you had the European migration crisis. A year later, you had this huge influx of refugees in Uganda, mainly from South Sudan. And so particularly in Europe, across the ideological spectrum, it was seen as a role model. For those among the progressive side of the spectrum, it was seen as an example of if such a poor country as Uganda can do it, why can't Europe do it? So we should fund it. On the other side of the ideological spectrum, more conservative voices are, look, this is an example of a regional host country. So refugees, they can stay in the region. So both sides could find themselves in it, and that was an incentive to fund it. But things have changed, particularly the relation between the quote-unquote West and Uganda has changed. Particularly since 21, the relations have become increasingly tense around the elections. President Museveni was particularly upset with the European Union, who he accused of funding the opposition, and the government spokesperson called the European ambassador charlatans. The Anti-Homosexuality Act, which came into law last year, is one stark illustration, but it's an illustration which made these relations particularly tense. But so for this transition, you need budget support, basically. So you need international donors to give budget support to the government. But in the current circumstances, this is particularly difficult because of these political tensions, but also because of corruption concerns, which have increased over the last years. So one humanitarian actor said, so we're desperate for development donors to step in and make clear that it's part of their remit, but no one is making a move. So what you see here is tensions between, on the one hand, Uganda, which is seen as a role model for refugees, but on the other hand, you have frictions between the diplomatic relations or the broader, geopolitical relations. And so, well, yeah, we talked about prioritization. It's been explained by Nina. So we have an overall situation in which funding has been strongly reduced. And so, again, Uganda is seen as a role model to test, well, what can we do with less funding? So Uganda is not only seen as a role model for refugee hosting, but also, well, what can we do with less money? So there was a very strong pressure, particularly from the major donors of the refugee exercise, which are the US and the UK. We cannot keep funding, give the same amount for funding to refugees forever. Some of these refugees, for example, in Nakivale settlement, they've been there for 20 years. We cannot keep them dependent on food aid forever. So this has been an ongoing debate between particularly UNHCR and the World Food Programme. What can we do about it? But suddenly this debate was forced to be implemented because funding had dried up because of Ukraine, because of less funding available. And this led to the prioritization exercise, which, yeah, led to a range of problems. So I've written about this in the New Humanitarian. Nina talked about it as well. But what I want to show here as well is that this is not only about geopolitics, it's not only about less funding, it's also, and that's a point we want to make, it's also about how organizations act. Both INGOs, UN agencies, and some government agencies. So what we argue is that the difficulties in the implementation of this transition approach and also of the prioritization approach has to do with how organization functions. And so we highlight three things: one, insulation; two, mission creep; and three, monopolies of power. The last point is about UNHCR, about how UN agencies and particularly UNHCR functions. Two is about UN agencies in general, and one is about both UN agencies and some government agencies. So yeah, we all know what insulation is. So it's the way in which organizations functions, but in silos. And so this siloed functioning also creates problems in the transition. For example, in the run-up to the prioritization policy, it was mainly drafted by the World Food Programme, but with strong tensions with other agencies. So there were strong complaints, particularly from the international NGOs, which had to implement these agencies, that this was badly prepared. Similar complaints are in the transition model. For example, there are complaints that humanitarian agencies, they're used to work, or a humanitarian response is used to work with INGOs, a development response is used to work with line ministries. And these two approaches don't necessarily align very well. The second point is mission creep. So there's a large debate within these humanitarian agencies about, well, who's the right agency to do this? So what we see here in the prioritization approach is a shift from a pure humanitarian policy to a more development-oriented policy about livelihoods. And so WFP is an archetypical humanitarian agent. It provides food assistance to refugees historically. But suddenly WFP also starts moving into this broader development field. It starts engaging in livelihood assistance. And on the one hand, this leads to criticism, and on the other hand, this also has an impact, many argue, on the results. So here, a quote of a humanitarian officer. So WFP, they see globally money for food aid is drying up, which is existential for them. They also see that livelihoods is critical in the long term. So if you're in WFP and you hear donors saying the most important is to get refugees or food aid, you hear which way the wind is blowing. So you see WFP as a form of survival politics or mission creep or extension of their mandates. So they move into other areas. So this officer says, well, this is not necessarily wrong, but others have some concerns about these policies. So some argue, one, this is inefficient. So you have agencies moving into the mandates of others. Some others have critique on expertise. For example, for WFP, questions are asked on their quality of their work and livelihoods, and also the lack of information and accountability. Others have critique on the cost of all of this. UN agencies are notoriously expensive, have way higher overheads than other agencies, and others have critique on the power of UN organizations, which raises questions of accountability. And so the last thing I want to argue is on power of particular agencies. And so here we particularly talk about the position of UNHCR in the refugee response. So many within the broader refugee response, particularly in Uganda, have concerns about the position of power in this and call UNHCR judge, jury, and executioner. So first of all, UNHCR is the one setting the overall amount needed for the refugee response. We've seen the figures in the presentation, and I also want to highlight that there's quite some critique on these figures, that they're a priori set too high. There's a really interesting article of Hugo Slim of Oxford in which he unpacks how the way in which needs are considered have risen exponentially over the years, and hence these amounts, which are not deemed realistic. But so to start with, they set the amount needed for the refugee response. Then 2, they look for these funds. Then 3, they use these funds to fund NGOs or to implement refugee services. Then they're also responsible for monitoring and evaluation. They also do oversight and safeguard, and they also do coordination and management. So here you see a table which show this. And so another humanitarian officer, for example, argues, so I don't know any other industry in the world, banking or other, in which you have one agency controlling everything, implementing, funding, making their own homework on how they perform, and all of this causes structural issues on accountability. And indeed, so over the last couple of years, there's been a number of corruption scandals in which UNHCR staff were involved. And so I've written about these, but the bottom line is it's very unclear and very unlikely that any form of accountability happens for this. There's also many concerns about accountability to donors. There is very minimal accountability of UN agencies in general to donors, and particularly in such a situation as UNHCR. So one diplomat summarized it, so there's a real sense of impotence towards the UN and getting any form of accountability. Yeah, I'll skip this. So to conclude, what we wanted to show in this presentation is, so the Ugandan refugee model is under major pressure due to 1, underfunding, 2, more tense relations between Western donors and the government, but also the way in which bureaucracies operate. So on the one hand, you have very difficult and very legitimate policy choices which have to be made. But on the other hand, these choices, they also get stuck in very bureaucratic, insulated practices. So the question is, well, what will this result? How long will the government of Uganda tolerate this? And it has been shown, there's a broad literature on what is called refugee rentierism. How refugees, will they be a bargaining chip in this broader negotiation between these agencies? I'll stop it here. Thank you.
Okay. Just try to get Frank under.
Okay, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
So thank you. I think that those 2 presentations were complementary, and I think it showed that there are several different aspects, both an organizational aspect and a humanitarian one and a development aspect to consider. I'm going to give the floor to Professor Frank for comments for about 10 minutes and questions or comments that you would like to raise. Just make sure that we can hear you.
Okay, hi everyone. Hi Nina, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you, Christophe, Ross, and Nina, for your presentations. Very brilliant. For me, really, I'm going to make follow-up comments if there are any questions, because really these are interesting, policy briefs, and I share or agree with most of the issues raised. I'm just going to start with Nina's presentation, which was the first presentation, and just make some brief comments. And I agree that yes, there is an increase in refugee numbers. The numbers you quote in the policy brief, if you compare with now, according to UNHCR, they are saying that by April 2024, the number of forced displaced persons had gone beyond 120 million. And so this has been the trend in terms of increase in refugee numbers each day that passes. And I'm very sure that if UNHCR is going to release the UNHCR Global Trends Report by the end of 2024, in June next year, you'll actually see the numbers have actually gone up, because we can actually see on the ground what is happening in different parts of the country. 40% are children in these forced displaced persons, 75% are hosted in low and middle income countries, so why Uganda finds itself. And then 69% are hosted in neighboring countries. So when refugees move, around close to 70% are hosted in the neighboring regions, the neighboring countries, South Sudan to Uganda, DRC to Uganda, and so on. Now, I just want to comment briefly that generally speaking, Uganda has had a progressive refugee policy. Whether you want to see it on ground, of course, without, I mean, it has challenges. Even when you give refugees land, you know very well that with the increase in refugee numbers, the plots of land have continued to reduce. Uganda's refugee management is guided by the 2006 Refugees Act, which is really, when you look at it, it is in line with the 1951 Convention, the 1967 Protocol, and the 1969 OA Convention. And it talks about refugee rights, you know, women's rights, children's rights. And generally speaking, really, you can see that it raises a number of, you know, issues in terms of rights, in terms of management, and how refugees can actually be, you know, integrated together with the host population. But there is also the 2010 refugee regulations, which also kind of, you know, guides the refugee operations in the country. Very briefly, I know this has been talked about somewhere else, but why open door policy? It's a number of reasons. They are national, regional, and international. At the national level, we have our leaders, politicians, the president, ministers who have been refugees before in Tanzania during the fight against Amin and Obote in the past. And so they understand what it means to be a refugee. So from a personal level, there is that understanding of what it means to be a refugee. And so you understand why there is this kind of positive attitude, this legislation, because then our leaders share and they have this experience of what it means to be a refugee. But also our population have been refugees before. In northern Uganda, this because of these kind of conflicts we have had in the past, our population have had to go to either DRC or South Sudan as refugees. And so they also share what it means. And so when refugees come, they're also paying back for the time they were hosted. Now, at the regional level, this is also part of, I think Nina talks about it somewhere, that Uganda hosts refugees as part of its role in the Great Lakes region, in mediation and peacekeeping roles, but also as part of Pan-Africanism, because then we, according to the president's statements in a different fora, is saying that these are African brothers and sisters. So you can see that helping these refugees is part of the Pan-African spirit, that we need to help people who are running out as refugees. At the international level, I know Christophe has talked about this, but it's one reason to say, well, to dodge accountability, questions about governance and human rights, because then you are playing the refugee card and saying, well, we are doing a good job here, and maybe the international community may not ask questions as regards to those democratic deficits and then human rights violations. And so these are some of the reasons as to why Uganda has tended to have this positive refugee policy generous. But of course, there are challenges on the ground. Even when you say that refugees can work, you know very well that finding work is a problem, because unemployment is a very big challenge, whether for the host population or the refugees. And so in theory, yes, they can work, but of course, finding work will be a problem. And I know there are writings which have been written, refugee economies and other articles which have really talked about the challenges of finding work. Even when you talk about residents, that they can choose where they can stay. But of course, the policy still says that if you want any support from government and humanitarian agencies, then you have to go to these designated refugee settlements that are spread all over the country. Self-reliance, I agree that there is a challenge on the ground. On paper, it looks okay that yes, when refugees come and they have stayed for a certain number of years, then over time they should be self-reliant. But of course, we know that on the ground it's a very big problem for them to be self-reliant, and there are questions of food insecurity. And these, of course, have happened because of climate change, and reduction of, soil fertility and so on has reduced over time. Nina also talks about the challenges of the self-reliance agenda, which I just wanted to add something that we should not forget that, especially when you look at Western and Northern Uganda, that these post-conflict areas, so apart from issues of climate change, and also assuming that these refugees are all from a rural rivalhood, from a rural background, we should not forget that these refugee hosting areas, the districts, are also in a post-conflict setting. We have had conflicts in Northern Uganda, in West Nile and so on. And so that also adds on the challenges. The host population are also, they also have their own challenges. And then you're also adding on these so many thousands of or hundreds of thousands of refugees who have come from DRC and then South Sudan. So already the hosting areas, especially in the northern part of the country, was already facing challenges since they're emerging out of conflict. Now, towards the end, Nina talks about, refugees have been asking themselves, so should I stay, should I go? And then they are trying to balance return and integration. And from my experience doing research in Ajumani, in Bidibidi, I have had these experiences from refugees who tell us that I can't stay here when I'm hungry. When my children are hungry, I cannot do anything. We are only eating one meal a day. And in a situation of scarcity, when there is no food, then food is only left to the children. You see? So a number of them have been forced to return home, but you can imagine the decision to return to South Sudan, whether that would be called voluntary or involuntary repatriation. And so the question is, with this reduction in funding and reduction in food rations and so on, are we contributing to involuntary repatriation? Are we not violating international law? These are the kind of questions to think about. Nina was talking about the spontaneous returns which go on every day. And my experience with engaging these refugees, when you do research and then you go back after 1 month, after some few months, the respondents that you had engaged with, when you go back, they are no longer there because of this kind of back and forth movements. But it's understandable given the challenges on ground. And then they're also talking about that you are given cash. And then they were saying that the cash that they are given, I can't remember the figures offhand, but they are saying this is money that you can just eat in 1 or 2 days. And so they were wondering, how can you give us this small amount of money and you expect a family of how many children and then the parents to really survive on that? As I try to conclude on Nina's presentation, because of time, she's saying that we need to improve legal certainty around land use rights and ownership for refugees. And then I have a question that aware that this land belongs to host communities and so on. How do we reconcile this? How do we improve legal certainty, for refugees around land? When the host population may not be willing, or in your view, do you think the host population are willing to really allow that we need to give some bit of certainty to refugees around issues of land and land access? And then lastly, I agree that, in my view, we cannot feed refugees forever and ever. And that's why we have all these challenges of reduced funding and so on. So for me, I'm looking at the broader picture. How do we engage on the question of durable solutions? How do we engage a country like Uganda on the question of local integration naturalization? Because we see in the past, countries like Tanzania, where donors engaged, was actually willing to naturalize Burundian refugees in the past. So is this a question we should be talking about, durable solutions? I know we can't talk about voluntary repatriation when the countries of origin are still at war and there are conflicts still going on. And so how then do we ensure that peace processes which have really been initiated, whether in the DRC, the Uhuru Kenyatta-led peace process in South Sudan, I know there have been problems with IGAD and so on. How do we ensure that these processes work so that they can encourage people to return home when eventually peace and security, when they return? But also in terms of resettlement, is there any way we can also have engagement? I know United States, Canada, Australia, Germany, Sweden, according to UNHCR reports, have been willing to engage and give more quotas to UNHCR in terms of resettlement. So are these the kind of questions we need to talk about? Otherwise, without durable solutions, we are going to have challenges of refugees starving, and then the donors reducing funding, and then we find ourselves in a very big challenge. Coming to Christophe Sandros's paper, thank you so much for the brilliant ideas. I agree with most of the things that I know you have said. Somewhere you talked about reduced funding around 2017. The budget started, dwindling and so on. And it reminded me of the Refugee Solidarity Summit that was hosted in June 2017 between the Uganda government and UNHCR, and of course the UN Secretary General, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, came. But out of a target of $2 billion, the government was able to get $358 million, which was around 17.7, or if you want, you can call it 18%. So already you can see the target that government wanted and then what was realized. And that, of course, really gives you an idea of the challenges in terms of raising funds to look after these refugees. And so, yes, the pressure from donors to stop giving blanket support to refugees, move away from humanitarian kind of funding to development assistance, yes. And then I like the idea of the transition policy, where our government is saying that we need to, transition and, give this refugee management and assistance to local governments. But of course, the question is who foot the bill? I think is the question. And then there are concerns around local government, where you're asking, are local governments ready to do this work? And of course, local governments also have their own problems, inefficiencies, not very good at offering public services. When you look at what has been going on, there have been worsening in these new districts, but also lack of readiness in these local governments. But of course, we should also not forget the corruption that you talked about at the national level. But also at the local government level, you also have these problems of corruption. And so I would understand the concerns. If you hand over to these local governments, are they able to deliver? When we hear all these drugs in hospitals, disappearing and so on, at the watch of these local government officials. I agree that the relations between the government and, of course, the West has been going down. I mean, as the relations have been deteriorating, and you raise a number of issues: the Anti-Homosexuality Act, the law, but also the fact that Uganda has been backsliding in terms of democracy. When you look at our elections, I think a lot is really wanting. You talk about the 2021 elections. You remind me around 2020 in November when Bobi Wine, one of the opposition leaders, was arrested, and then the killings in Kampala and other cities. And to my surprise, we have not had accountability around these kind of issues. You see, people died. I don't know, we were told so many people died and so on, a report. But you see, you don't hear much about accountability of these officials who really, but also the willingness from government to prosecute these people who are really behind this kind of killings. The corruption, yes, the corruption in parliament, really, where the United States has had to sanction the speaker and former ministers. UK has also put sanctions. United Arab Emirates has also, put sanctions. And here I'm saying that I'm even surprised that the European Union has really not done anything. I don't know, there could be behind the scenes issues, but at least we have not had this kind of, could be condemnation here and there, but would also have expected this kind of, actions, tough actions to really say that these issues of corruption are really not, cannot be given kind of, we close our eyes to this kind of things. Towards the end, yes, one thing I want to talk about is that if the local governments have to take over, then of course we also have to look into matters of the law, 2006 Refugees Act. In one of the articles I wrote around 2019, 2020, when I was praising the Refugees Act, I think I made an observation that the local governments are really, they have taken a key role. And as of course, as we talk about the transition, they want to assume more role, but the act is a bit silent on these local governments and so on. Yes, we are at a time when we don't know what is next. Their transition is this end of the refugee model, and then you talk about these threats from the ministers, from the Minister of Refugees, Honorable Hilary Onek, saying that the refugees, they are stealing from the host population. Saying that if the international community does not cooperate, we are going to close or we are going to change the policy. But I've also heard him saying that he has been calling upon the countries of origin, South Sudan, DRC, that they should also start paying money to start feeding these refugees here, their own population who are here. But of course, we have not had much in terms of action, whether government is going to follow up with these governments, but also I don't know whether it can work. But of course, hearing these statements from the minister, I'm sure you can see that there are frustrations on the part of government on how they are going to look after these increasing numbers of refugees. And then lastly, there is an example of a country called Tanzania, because of the failure by the international community to engage and fund. We have had an experience where in 1996, because of so many refugees from Rwanda, Tanzania, which was actually used to be a very hospitable country with open door policies to refugees, just woke up one day and gave a deadline to Rwandan refugees to return home. And at first, the UNHCR and other agencies thought that, this is not going to happen, but it actually happened. And refugees were given a deadline of 31st December 1996, and these camps were actually closed. And so at the moment, these could be threats. And we have seen this also with Rwanda, where, because of the criticism of supporting M23 and the conflict in the DRC, threatening to chase away the Congolese refugees and evict them. At the moment, these could be threats, but we have had some experience of the example I'm giving you, Tanzania, where he has actually went ahead to implement and close the camps. So maybe in the Ugandan situation, we may not go to this kind of direction, but I just wanted to give this example to show that in the African setting, some countries have gone, this kind of direction. And you can imagine closing camps by Tanzania of around 600,000 refugees and more, and giving them a deadline. You can imagine what exactly happened. I know some of them tried to come to Uganda, but a number of them went to number of their reports, a number of them were arrested, killed, and so on. But of course, these are things we don't want to talk about. That then a country is forced to either close camps and so on. I'm going to stop here because of time, but I want to say thank you so much for this opportunity to reflect on this Uganda's model with all these kind of challenges on the ground. When the numbers keep on increasing and yet on the ground, there's resources to look after them really not forthcoming. I think it's a very big challenge that it's important for us to talk about. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you so much for those exhaustive comments and questions. I think I'm going to open the floor to the audience before I let the speakers answer to the questions. And I will first turn to the audience that are here in this room for questions or comments that you might have. If you could then just state your name and your organization, and that's about it. And then make a comment or a question. And then I'll turn to the online audience. Yes.
Okay, I came in late, I'm sorry. I had another commitment. My name is Miriam Black. I'm Uganda's ambassador in Brussels, accredited to the Benelux countries and the EU. And I happen to have worked in UNHCR. So I have had thousands of refugees in Kenya from Uganda at that time, among whom are many of the leaders that we currently have in the country. And indeed, like the professor stated, I think the open door policy is a result of many of us knowing what it is to be a refugee. And the president has stated it many times, he would never turn back an African who is in problem in a home country. And I think that open door policy would like to adhere to it. I'm very proud of the Compact for Refugees, the UN model that was based on the Uganda situation. I have visited also the settlements and the reception center in Bidi, and I have received delegations from our minister last year and with UNHCR and Minister Onek this year. They came again, basically a fundraising session, because it is nice to know that we are doing well, we are being praised. Of course, I mean, I agree with some of the comments that I've heard from you, Christoph, but it is all right. And the model will work up to a certain point whereby we have funding, because I think it is good to praise Uganda and say, okay, the refugees are welcome. They are going to be treated the same as the host communities. We are in the north giving them 100 meters by 100 meters land. But yeah, when there are more refugees coming, like in the east now, because of the DRC situation, that land is reduced to 50 by 50, as there's no other land. Yeah. Now, how are you going to reduce it? 25 to 25. That's no longer a plot of land where you can, grow your own food on. So these are really, really challenges. I must admit that I can understand the frustration of our minister very, very much. before any disasters happen, like refugees are dying, because we have done a lot as a government. We have even taken out loans, 50 million with the World Bank to build more schools. I've been to the Bidi schools there, where, you know, they do like 2 or 3 sessions a day because the classrooms are so big. People are sitting on the floor everywhere. So they get from 9 to 12, from 12 to 3, and from 3 to 6. That is host community and refugees. So we are really up at I would say, the maximum of what we are able to provide in terms of services. And then we get to know from the EU has still contributed this year. We were there with ECHO, and they have contributed again, but it's not enough. It's just a drop on a hot plate. And I do agree with some of the comments that were made, even by Professor, that corruption is indeed a problem. So when there was this scandal in the office of the Prime Minister, where the refugees fall under, yes, I mean, I can understand that donors become very hesitant to provide more funding. And they were the ones who were then looking at UN organizations again, because UN is supposed to be not corrupt. But in reality, we know what happens on the ground, and there were also involvement of others. I like this session. I would like to thank our host for this session, because it's like a brainstorming. How can we improve the effective delivery of services to our refugees, and how we can avoid potential dangers of like having to be forced to close some of the settlements? I think the issue of providing nationality, naturalizing refugees is not yet an issue that comes up, because I think we are working hard to achieve peace in South Sudan. As you know, almost 900,000 refugees are from South Sudan. So we believe that, once there is some sense of security there, that we can have voluntary repatriations. I don't want to take up so much time, but I thank you very much. And I would love to continue discussions on how to improve and what kind of model can we deliver that is more effective than maybe letting UNHCR be everything like you had stated. Thank you so much.
Thank you for intervention, Eric.
Well, also would like to thank very much the speakers, because it was really very interesting how you went from the local level to more general problems and analysis. I appreciate it very much. I have 2 questions. So if I understood it correctly, but please correct me if I'm wrong, but people of funds, donors are giving money to the UNHCR because of migration. I guess, okay, there was a link made with migration. Now, is it possible to make the link with conflicts in the region? So, I mean, I don't know to what extent you have an idea about the profile of the refugees in those camps, but if they are sent back to their home countries, is there a risk of increasing conflict in the region? I mean, do you have an idea of that? I don't know. And the second one is, does the Ugandan government monitor the situation of refugees, or do they leave everything to the UN? So do they have the institutional and technical capacity to monitor a very complex situation with a lot of aspects for management of this?
Right, so Eric Kennis, who's working in the Africa program, is the senior research fellow. I also have one question, if there is no other question here. You were talking about the advantages for the host country, that there were several advantages as well for the host country in terms of getting that type of assistance. And I'm wondering, is there anything that Rwanda, who has been on the table now of taking in refugees from actually shipping or flying out refugees, asylum seekers from the UK to Rwanda, is this something that Rwanda is looking at and copying to for benefits? And have you looked into the comparison between the new approach by Rwanda to reach out actually to different Western states to handle refugee, whatever we call it, the refugee influx or crisis can be dehumanizing, but the arrival of refugees to Europe and the UK. So if there are no more questions, then I'll hand over the floor again to Nina and then Christophe and Rose for answering, and you pick and choose which questions and comments you would like to address.
So firstly, to add on what Ambassador Black has said about how to engage with sustainable solutions for refugees and if the naturalization of refugees would be an option. Based on while I was there last year, I also conducted research on feelings of belonging among refugees. And this is a bit to contradict this rhetoric of we should not encourage them to stay, they can't rely on food forever. From the interviews I conducted, many really expressed a desire to return home, with very few considering staying in Uganda when it would be safe for them to go home. So this is just a short point. And then to respond to Professor Frank's question on how to reconcile land issues between refugee and host communities. So in Uganda, land ownership is based on customary tenure, so among tribes. And as the ambassador also has mentioned, both the quality but the size of land for refugees have been reduced over the past months due to the increasing pressure of the refugee influx in Uganda. So on the one hand, you have refugees that are looking for more land, and on the other, you also have hosts that are struggling, as Frank said, in a post-conflict affected setting, who have their own challenges. And so I think this brings us back to a broader and also interlinked question of those relations between refugee and host communities. As was mentioned, they do share an experience of displacement due to history. Some of them, particularly in northern Uganda, which is a tri-border area between South Sudan, the DRC, and Uganda, also share close ethnic but linguistic ties. But yet tensions continue to occur. So I don't have the answer to your question, Professor Friend, but I think this brings us back to the broader question of sustainable solutions, not only for refugees, but also for the affected host communities.
Thank you. Rose and Christophe.
Yeah, thank you for all the comments. I think I pick up also on a topic where Nina also said that she heard during her fieldwork that many refugees in the north don't express necessarily the wish to forever stay in Uganda. I've conducted fieldwork in Adjumani for 2 months during the summer, and then I heard the same. Many people do actually express the wish to go back, and this wish seems to have grown a bit when, well, there was always circular movement, let's be very clear about that, but it seems to have grown after food prioritization happened. And then a phrase that I heard quite often actually, and that is that people expressed that they would rather die of a gunshot back in South Sudan than they would die of hunger in Uganda, which is something that was repeated among many refugees in different settlements in Adjumani, and also something that was recognized by OPM on a regional level. Even though many people, I think this highlights that people do want to go back, but also know that there is a lot of insecurity when they go back. To answer a bit your question, Eric. Some people have expressed that if people go back to South Sudan, there might be people from other tribes that are on their ancestral land. So this can also cause conflict. So even when you repatriate people, it can actually cause some conflicts. There are also some instances where people who had returned from Uganda back to South Sudan had been murdered, unfortunately, around the Kajukeji area in South Sudan. This is also why UNHCR is not considering South Sudan as a safe country for voluntary repatriation at the moment. So if people return, it's really on their own terms. And officials are saying that, I mean, of course, the policy is not designed, prioritization and also transition is not designed to push people back. But at the same time, also officials express this feeling of, I mean, if people want to go back, they are free to do so, which is a bit maybe contradictory, but also maybe understandable because of this freedom of movement, which should then officially has as a consequence that people lose their refugee identity from the moment they cross the border with South Sudan. On the question on Rwanda, I haven't looked into that, unfortunately, but there are some very interesting parallels to get from there.
All right. Thanks everyone for these comments and questions. They were really useful, and I like the idea of a seminar as a brainstorm, which I think is a very useful way of looking at these things. I'll start with the Rwanda question, the last one. Yeah. So within the broader academic literature in the last decade, more and more attention has been given to look at African governments, rightly so, not only as passive actors, but also as very active actors in the international system and in international relations. And you can see this in the field of refugees, and the Kagame government in Rwanda is particularly an active agent on the international level, including with refugees. In January 23, the Rwandan government threatened to close refugee camps or to send back Congolese refugees in response to criticism on the MT23 rebellion, on its support there. And it's always, well, it historically has played an active role in this question of refugee policies. Israel sent back its African refugees to Rwanda between 2013 to 18. Denmark had a same agreement as the UK to send back its refugees to Kigali and so on. On Eric's question on the management of these refugees and the role of the Ugandan government, so what's unique in the Ugandan model is that it's a co-management between UNHCR and Ugandan governments. So it's co-signed and co-managed response by UNHCR and the government. And so this includes on the various levels. So the settlements, for example, they're co-management by the Office of the Prime Minister and UNHCR. And so this includes that also the monitoring and so on is a joint exercise.
Despite insulation, we were talking about it.
Despite this insulation, yeah, indeed. So perhaps I should have clarified that this insulation indeed takes place at the national level. At the local level, this is very much a close working relationship. So your question on the risk on conflict, let me unpack that a bit, and let us go back to prioritization as well. So when this prioritization exercise was prepared, there was a major fear among the international NGOs who basically had to implement and who are working in the settlements, that there was a grave security risk. Because also in the past, when similar policies had been implemented, there had been protests and there had been violence of these refugees, which was targeted against the implementing agencies. So their concern was, well, WFP is preparing this exercise and is not taking our concerns on board. And that's why it was postponed, because there was a major security fear. And that's also why security agencies were involved in sensitization. And at some point, there was a fear that it became too securitized, but none of this happened. So in the end, there were no real protests. Well, and if we link back to Nina's presentation, you can say people, they can have two ways of reacting, exit or voice. So voice would be the protest, exit would be going back to their home countries or other forms, and it's clear that the exit option was used there. So, and on the other part of the question, what does it mean for conflict in the home countries? Well, I don't think that should be exaggerated. I guess you're thinking of 94 Goma, when refugee camps were used as training grounds for rebel groups, etc. You don't see these dynamics in Ugandan settlement. What you see is a very large mobility of the refugees. So many South Sudanese, for example, they, because of this lack of food assistance or land or work, they go back to South Sudan, but they return when the rations arrive. So you see a high degree of mobility for the South Sudanese already, without necessarily feeding into conflict dynamics. So you don't see dynamics of recruitment and so on.
Is it the same case for the Congo? I mean, the idea I had was more that if donors don't want to fund, you could say, okay, if you don't fund it, you will also increase the conflict potential in the region.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. potentially, I don't directly see it. What for donors, or particularly for European donors, is much more an incentive. It's the whole migration question and the migration crisis, and that's why the engagement of international donors is that important, because it does play a role on an international level. Yeah. With Frank's comments, I don't have anything to add. Yeah, they were really brilliant comments, which were not really questions, and with which I agree. Thanks, Frank.
Yeah. Frank, do you want to react to any of the comments or questions that came up during this round?
Yes, but very briefly, because my worry that when we start to talk about these things, then we don't want to consume a lot of time. But yes, our Uganda's ambassador to EU, Belgium, I liked her comments. Of course, she's saying that borrowing to fund refugees, but also the emphasis is on voluntary repatriation if peace can return to South Sudan. My only worry is that when is that going to happen? Because we have had all these peace processes. When you think you are there, then along the way things turn around, and of course it is kind of an endless kind of process. Naturalization, not yet, and I know there is no appetite on the part of government to naturalize. I remember some time back there was some issue that was talked about in Parliament, where the government was saying that for these long-term refugees, I think to some extent Congolese, Rwandans, who have stayed in Uganda for more than 20 years, and it was toward this election. So the very moment it was talked Parliament, you see, President Museveni is now looking for Ugandans and then his voters, you see. So the reaction from the members of Parliament really could show that the president has an interest and is trying to make refugees Ugandans, then he can get voters. And because of that reaction, of course, it was shelved. But of course, it is a very problematic issue and so on, resources and so on. But I was just trying to raise it as, especially for this long term. I've been here for a long time. People are born here. To some extent, maybe it can sort of course, not very many refugees, but just a few numbers. Risk of increasing conflict when refugees, return and so on. Just adding on what what Ross was saying, and then of course Christoph, that of course we are not looking at this situation of the 1990s where thousands and hundreds of thousands of Rwandans were forced to move from DRC, Eastern Congo, Goma, camps to Rwanda. We're not looking at that scale. But I guess there could also be challenges when you don't organize a return, because I know returns are supposed to be organized where there is a tripartite commission, kind of an agreement, tripartite agreement between the country of origin, country that is hosting, and then UNHCR, and then of course all of them have responsibilities on what they are supposed to do, so that it's an orderly process. Otherwise, if you don't do it in an orderly way, then you have a challenge of where people return and then they start fighting for same pieces of land. And like Ross was saying, then people start killing themselves because of these tribal issues. So there are this kind of risks. Very briefly around, does Uganda government monitor refugees? Yes, like Christoph was saying, Office of the Prime Minister is very active on ground. But also because of the security dynamics around refugees, we have also, of course, there's also police presence, but also the army. The army also has some presence of the army. And I know for a fact that one of the deputy camp commandants is an internal security organization official who actually reports to the Office of the President, especially on security matters. And this is because of the previous experiences Uganda has had, with refugees, the Rwandans, the Tutsi refugees who are here in Uganda and then organized to go back. So Uganda really monitors. I was in Adjumani and there's actually the refugee desk officer was telling me that behind his office, there is actually he told me a detach of an army to monitor these kind of activities. And of course, government will be very much interested in seeing these movements and if there are any evidence of recruitment in these refugee settlements. I don't know whether you heard recently that in Changwari settlement, really there was someone who was arrested, I think an official of M23, who was actually recruiting some of these Congolese refugees. So it is understandable that Uganda has to monitor the activities of refugees because of the past experience. Lastly, Rwanda taking in more refugees from UK and so on. I think my brief comments are that I'm happy that when the new prime minister came in, he just said that this thing is just dead at arrival. You see, because I know the Sunak, the former prime minister, was actually promoting this, even when there were challenges in the High Court, Court of Appeal, and then Supreme Court, and then of course they were moving around to come up with other policies. And so, I mean, I'm one of the observers who was saying that really this is very unfortunate. First of all, UK running away from responsibility. But also when you see the reports that have been written, whether in academic circles, but also Amnesty International, but also UNHCR report itself, I think they are saying that really, in terms of human rights and so on, Rwanda is not a country where you can actually return, I mean, where you can send refugees, because I know that Rwanda currently hosts around 130,000 refugees, mainly from DRC and Burundi. But when you see the human rights situation in Rwanda, the 2018 riots by the Congolese refugees because of the reduction in food rations, and then a number of them killed. You see, and there has never been accountability on those police officials who actually killed the refugees. There are a number of things, of course, you can talk about. And also there's that committee that looks after, refugee status determination. Reports have been saying that it's not qualified. I mean, the people who are there, it doesn't do a good job. And many other issues, of course, Rwanda is a very, problematic country. And so I would agree with the Court of Appeal in the UK and the Supreme Court, who are saying that really the human rights situation in Rwanda would not allow such kind of transfer of refugees to Rwanda. But I know for a fact that Rwanda has been using it as a way of, kind of have, I don't know how to call it, different, try to run away from accountability and issues of human rights, and then trying to play a refugee card showing that, yeah, we can do the job, and then the international community can remain silent on some of these problems in Rwanda. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those extensive comments. I'm going to take a last round of questions, I think, before we close. Is there any questions in the room? Yes. Yeah.
Well,
Ambassador?
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Not so much of a question, like it would be great if we have the answers to all the questions that were raised, especially how can we improve the model that we have in Uganda, as it's indeed very problematic on how we are managing the situation right now. And I'm very touched by your remark, Rose, to say that, yeah, some refugees, it's a rather terrible statement that they prefer to die of a bullet in South Sudan, yeah, rather than of hunger in Uganda. And that shows you the real crisis that we have, because even last year and this year, when I was with the minister and UNHCR, I was also told that people from the DRC, which, Eastern DRC is very unsafe environment, there are more than 100 what we call negative forces, yeah, groups like, fighting for whatever cause. And therefore, there's a lot of insecurity. People come to the reception center, where normally WFP had guaranteed our refugees 1 meal a day. But WFP, because of reduced funding as well, had to now come and say, yeah, by July last year, they were not going to manage the funding of at least 1 meal a day. And what you then see also, when the refugees have been in the reception center, will then have to go to the settlements, they prefer to go back to Eastern Congo because they said in the settlements they can't survive. So they have been a lot of up and down from Eastern Congo to the settlements that we have in Eastern Uganda. Then I don't want to complicate matters here a great deal by bringing up another issue, but it is of environmental concern. We have in northern Uganda more than 900,000 refugees. And apart from if there is food, I mean, food is a priority beyond any doubt, but they have to cook it. And how do they cook it? They use the 3-stone method with getting firewood from our forests. And if you've seen the depletion of our forests, and when we try to grow more forests, yeah, it is not quick enough that we can grow more forest by the destruction of the present forests that are existing. Now, where do you get also conflicts between host communities and refugees? I know there in Germany, for instance, that people have from time memorial their little forest to get their wood from, and they live, you know, relatively in symbiosis with what's growing there. Now, when the refugees come there, the local population said, no, you're not coming for firewood here. You go to the next forest, which maybe is 5 or 10 kilometers away. And I heard from some of the reports that I've read, but Professor Frank may know more, that a refugee family on average needs a medium-sized tree per day to cook their food on. And that you can imagine with so many years of having so many refugees, what damage has been done to our environment. So I've been advocating for finding ways for clean cooking, not only in refugees communities and host communities, but everywhere, because we are the ones who in Kampala who demand charcoal, which is coming from other regions, yeah. And so we are also contributing to the deforestation processes. But as I said, the primary responsibility is to ensure that the refugees have food. But thank you so much for this interesting seminar. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes.
Can I just, my name is Thomas Roos. I'm working for the Ministry of the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in charge of development cooperation of Uganda. So like the follow-up of all the NGOs. And I wanted to ask Professor Titica about the transition of social services from the NGOs to the local government. If you can clarify this a little bit more. Because what I saw when I was visiting the Reno camp in 2021, where the projects the neighbor was conducting for skilling and other actors were also in this kind of like nexus approach, trying to get a little bit of transition to empower them. For instance, the South Sudanese refugees, somehow also that they can use the skills they were getting also perhaps later on in stuff.
Any other last question?
I
Yeah,
have-
Astrid.
So I'm a trainee at the Egmont Institute, and I had a question with regards to the issues of mandate expansion, mission creep, and also organizations being insulated in the way they operate. So you mentioned that the Ugandan government seems to be cooperating well with UNHCR and other agencies on the ground and at the local level. And I was wondering if you think that lessons drawn from grassroots level or local levels could be used to maybe induce change at higher levels and improve cooperation or exchanges at least at higher levels. I don't have any experience when it comes to refugee crises, but I've worked on forum shopping and peace processes, or also how development cooperation implementation can be hindered by the fact that actors don't have any exchanges of information. So that was my question.
So maybe start,
Yeah.
Christoph.
Yeah.
Most questions were addressed to you this time.
Thanks. I'll start with the first comment of the ambassador. On the environmental concerns, well, I'm happy to say we just got funding from the VLID-OS, from the Flemish government, and we are starting a project exactly on that, and 2 Ugandan PhD students at Mbarara University, with the help of Frank, will look exactly at these dynamics. So one on exact sciences, so it will be more on to measure environmental impact, and another PhD student will be social sciences, so to look at the processes at stake. We had our kickoff meeting yesterday, actually.
Oh, nice.
So yeah, we're recruiting 2 Ugandan PhD students. On the transition questions, well, I'll let Rose explain in detail, but it's basically, so it's a shift from humanitarian assistance to development approach, and indeed the local government taking over key services, but I'll let Rose explain that a bit more. So the question, so from the grassroots to the national level, yeah, thanks, very good question. But so yeah, it's different responsibilities. So really at the national and international level, it's about thinking about the policies and how to draft policies. At the local level, it's much more the implementation level. So it's very different tasks and very different priorities as well.
Did you want to come in as well, Rose?
Yes, I will comment on the question around transition. So transition is not something that really or in the ideal setting, it wouldn't actually affect refugees that much. So nothing really will change for refugees. It's more of a management issue where management, for example, for a school, many schools are now in the refugee and around the refugee settlements are run by NGOs. So a lot of teachers are paid, or most teachers are paid by NGOs. And if we keep talking about education, if a school gets coded by the government, this means that the government will take over the management of the school. So actually in an ideal situation, the quality of the lessons, the number of teachers available wouldn't reduce or even increase in the most ideal situation. Yeah, so this also, but what we see now is that this happens more gradually. So there was, for example, a school which had a secondary school, which has been coded as a government school from the 1st of July, which is the start of the financial year, this year in Adjumani, and then there were over 40 staff members, and then 13 staff members have been transferred. Yeah, but not everything. So what is, I think, the most reasonable for this moment is that the government takes on some. On paper, the school is transitioned, but then over time, if also the government has more capacity to hire public servants, that this will be increased. I hope this answers. Yeah. So, but it's not so much something that it touches refugee lives, and also refugees don't seem that much aware about the situation. So also we wrote, I think it's in a footnote in the policy brief, that it's mainly the refugee leaders that are gathering in Kampala, the democratically elected refugee leaders in the Refugee Engagement Forum, that know about this and that talk about this as well. But on the settlement level itself, many people don't seem to be aware that this is happening, which might, of course, increase if it goes further. So, for example, for the water sector, we didn't really highlight it in the presentation. The water sector is a bit different than education and health, because for water services, people normally do pay for the maintenance of these systems, which is run by a government agency. In rural areas, this is the umbrella organization. So refugees will have to pay a little bit if the water systems are transferred. But people from the umbrella organization in the north told me that this will be a bit lower rate than what hosts pay.
Thank you. You want to add something?
I actually just have a question for you. I'm not really familiar on the details of this transition policy, but so Christophe, you mentioned that between the grassroots level and then the higher national level, there's differences in priorities and tasks. But then now in parallel with this whole rhetoric of self-reliance, there's now the emergence of this localization agenda. And so you mentioned the involvement of refugee leaders in this transition strategy. How will refugee-led organizations or community-based organizations be involved, or not at all?
For now, I haven't heard that they will be.
Yeah.
Okay, it's just a question. I really don't know.
No, it's not that they're specifically involved, but there's a mechanism. It's called the what's it called? The Refugee Engagement Forum.
Yeah, refugee. And the Refugee Welfare Council.
Yeah, so they have these monthly meetings or whatever periods in Kampala, where representatives of the settlements come and meet in Kampala with the INGO, the humanitarian international NGOs, and with other actors, and so where they discuss these issues, and they're most tapped into these debates, whereas most of the refugees are not aware of these issues. Yeah.
Thank you. If there are no further questions, then I would like to thank all of the speakers and also, of course, the moderator, Professor Frank, for an interesting and engaging discussion. I think that it has shown that the refugee hosting is a cross-disciplinary topic. We have touched upon issues such as environmental degradation, education problems. We talked about the conflict in the regions, and we've also talked about the different organizational problems, and also about the distinction between humanitarian and development aid. So if anything, it shows that we need more research, and I'm glad to hear that you have funding for 2 more PhD students on that topic in particular. So with that, I would like to thank the speakers, and I would also like to thank the audience for being here, both online and in the room. And we talked a little bit about where do the refugees come from? Well, they come from neighboring countries, and with the Egmont Institute, we're also organizing. I think it's in less than 2 weeks. We have a seminar about the borders of Congo.
It's next Tuesday.
Next Tuesday, perhaps you could say two words about that seminar.
Well, I hope you're interested. Of course, the problem of the borders between two countries are sometimes problematic. And so it has been an issue in Congo for a long time, and specifically with the conflict that is going on in the east of the country. We're having Professor Chibangu Kalala, who wrote something as a Bible on the borders of Congo. He wrote an enormous book with all the details about the limitation of the borders of the Congo in historical times, and he will focus specifically on the border between Congo and Rwanda and Uganda. It's for next week, so it's on Tuesday at 2:00, and I hope you all will be there.
So Tuesday at 2:00 is our next seminar here, and you're all very welcome. And then later on in October, we will also have a brainstorming meeting together with the new External Action Service, EU External Action Service Special Envoy for the Great Lakes region. But we're coming back to you with more details on that topic. But for those of you who are online, but of course also the ones here, please look at our website for all the updates. And again, please join me in thanking the speakers for excellent presentation.